It's a great pleasure to be here. You seem to be getting quite a lot of sex at the moment, as a cathedral. And I've heard Dermot McCulloch's talk about his book, which is online if you haven't heard it yet. And Dermot and I have discussed this in many occasions. Dermot on one occasion said everything he knew about the clitoris he owed to me, which is quite a worrying line. So I'm here because I wrote a book, Immaculate Forms, which talks about the history of the female body and focuses on 4 parts. If you're asked to write a book on the history of women's bodies, what do you do? Where do you start? And I chose to go for 4 areas which have been described as legible flesh, body parts that can carry meaning. And that means I'm going from the visible to the invisible, from the outside to the inside, and going breasts, clitoris, hymen, womb. Most of this talk will be about telling you one story about each of those parts of the body. And the book goes from the ancient Greek world, well, actually a little bit of ancient Hebrew as well, to the present day. And it focuses on Western Europe because that's what I know about. So why the history of women's bodies? 2 reasons, really. One was very much a contemporary concern with medicine. You'll read a lot in the press at the moment about how women are disadvantaged in healthcare because the 70-kilogram white male has been the norm for a lot of assumptions about the body. And there are lots of other interesting and worrying aspects here to do with the race side of this, particularly the proven evidence that Black women are more likely to have problems in childbirth, that they're not going to be taken seriously. And actually, it's not being taken seriously because you're a woman, and then even more because you're a Black woman, is a really big thing. So taking the 70-kilogram white male as the norm means that the history of drug testing has often been carried out on those people rather than on women, because women are weird, because they have hormones that change, and they're not sort of stable like those 70-kilogram men apparently are. There are also questions around symptoms. There's still a debate about whether women's heart attack symptoms are intrinsically different from men's, or whether it's just that the sort of spectrum of symptoms falls a little differently in women. And one of the key topics of my book is similarity and difference. How much are men and women basically the same, with a few different bits? How much are they fundamentally different? And because I go from the ancient Greek world onwards, I'm starting with a historical period in which women are seen as fundamentally different in every bit of their flesh. Not just a few different organs, but everything is different in a woman. But also Christianity, where women's bodies have been used as a reason for excluding them from all sorts of roles, and have been seen basically as very different to men's bodies. And that matters, because Christianity is a religion that talks about bodies. It talks about God taking on flesh, Jesus as fully human and fully divine. Somehow that hasn't been used to suggest that women are included fully in that. One of the aspects of that is the representation of salvation history from from Eve to Mary, that Eve to Mary line. Eve's body as alluring and dangerous, Mary's body as pure, but also impossible, both virgin and mother. And because Western medicine derives from ancient Greece, and early Christianity was in dialogue with ancient Greek and Roman ideas, quite a lot of this has sort of merged. My favorite image to show the merger is an image from the 1600s of Adam and Eve coming to see Jesus, the apothecary, in a beautiful apothecary shop with shelves of labeled drugs, coming as he writes out a prescription for original sin. So that's where Adam and Eve and Adam and Eve and Jesus come together. But I keep saying Mary, there's a reason for that, I'll get to that. But also medicine and religion as guides to how our bodies work, but also to what our bodies mean. And all of that has a history. Bodies have a history. It's not a linear history of gradual progress towards knowing everything. If we thought we knew everything in medicine now, that would be exactly what everyone has thought in history up till now. So why should we be right? Our periods were seen as the result of that wet, spongy flesh that absorbed too much fluid that the ancient Greeks talked about. Until the early 20th century, that's recent, when we started to know more about ovulation. So in the old model of the body, dominant through the 19th century, if you missed a menstrual period, it was thought your blood must be lurking somewhere inside you. You couldn't actually miss a period. If you were just eating and drinking normally, you'd absorb more fluid from your body because you're wet and spongy, and that would have to come out once a month, otherwise you'd die, basically. I will be coming back to that lurking blood. And also in terms of body parts and what they do. In the 16th century, there was the discovery of the clitoris. Funnily enough, it had been mentioned before, but in 1559, Realdo Colombo, a surgeon, announced he'd discovered it. He wasn't sure what it was for, but he thought it had quite extraordinary effects on women's bodies. But at the same time, same century, the great anatomist Andreas Vesalius argued that the clitoris was a freak of nature. If you had one, there was something wrong with you. Similar sort of thing with hymens. They're denied and they're celebrated on and off. It's not a progress thing. And then that word flourishing, with which I started my title. From my context as a member of General Synod of the Church of England, it's a reference to what's called mutual flourishing. We have something in the Church of England called the 5 Guiding Principles, which start off by saying, we have acknowledged that women can be priests, and then goes on to say, but if you don't agree, that's okay too. Does that help women to flourish? Particularly women in ministry and women in ordained ministry. The Theological College at Cuddesdon, Ripon College, did a project called Eve's Call, some years ago, in which ordained women and women training for ordination shared the comments that had been made about them, and they were quite extraordinarily misogynistic. Things like, how can I take you seriously as a priest when you're so pretty? Really? Comments about, you should wear your hair up, it's distracting when it's down, it makes me too overexcited. Really? So are women flourishing in the Church of England, even though we've had women priests for decades? And in terms of women's health more widely, are women flourishing? Think about fat shaming, think about cosmetic surgery, breast and butt implants, labiaplasty, operations to make you look like what? Normal? Perfect? What people see in pornography? None of this is good, this pressure on women to have the right sort of body. So my basic argument would be that we need to have good models of the female body, but also good theology if women are to flourish. Remembering always that in Christ, God took on our flesh, so it's not spirit, soul, good, flesh, body, bad anymore. We need to think about bodies in a positive way, not as irrelevant to who we really are. But that word flourishing is also a reference to the history of seeing women's bodies in floral ways. The menstrual fluid used to be described as flowers, because you need flowers before fruit. That was from the idea that you need menstrual blood to make a baby. Flowers before fruit, but also when you're a teenager and your breasts are developing, they're described as breast buds. The clitoris and the hymen have both been seen as flowers. There's a lot of floral terminology, and I'll come back to that in my very last point. But first, breasts. Big question, are breasts maternal or sexual, and can they do both at once? In Anthony Trollope's Dr. Thorne, a novel from 1858, he talks about Lady Arabella, Of course, Lady Arabella could not suckle the young heir herself. Ladies Arabella never can. They are gifted with the powers of being mothers, but not nursing mothers. Nature gives them bosoms for show, but not for use. So think about that one, for show and not for use. But when we come to where the Christian church has come into this one, the early church, taking on board the images of the body from ancient medicine, argued that milk and blood were the same thing. Women, wet and spongy, produce more blood. That blood can then convert to milk to feed a baby. This is part of a bigger idea that bodily fluids are on a scale of heat. So menstrual blood is cold, I mean, not to touch as such, it's a sort of conceptual cold. Menstrual blood is cold, milk is slightly warmer, and of course the most superior form of fluid in the human body, semen, is hot. So women are sort of not quite there. They can make their blood into milk, but not into semen. They're not hot enough. But menstrual blood is transformed to milk. That's the fundamental thing for this discussion of breasts. Mary is often represented feeding Jesus. That's partly about focusing on the human aspects of Jesus, fully man, fully God. This is the fully man, fully human aspect. But then when you start to show Mary breastfeeding, there's the risk that you might start to introduce the sexual side of breasts. So if you look at images of Mary breastfeeding, sometimes the breast is a funny shape, doesn't look very breast, really. Sometimes it's just really neatly sort of coming out from the side of her clothing. Everything else is really neat, no sign of dishevelment. That might suggest something a bit more sexual. And that image of Mary breastfeeding has then been used by male saints to think about their own experience, their own spiritual experience. So St. Bernard famously was given the power to preach by seeing himself taking milk from Mary, but being shot as a jet towards him because you don't want to go too near. That might be a bit sexy. So my story for breasts. Eleanor Duglioli, a real woman. She was born in 1472, and she's now the Blessed Eleanor Duglioli in the Roman Catholic Church, only since the 1820s. If you go to Bologna, you can visit her tomb. It's a little bit off the tourist route, but it's very worth seeing. She was a very pious woman. She experienced visions. She was very wealthy, sufficiently wealthy to commission Raphael to produce a painting of her favourite saint, Cecilia, which is not the original in the church anymore, but the copy is there. Eleanor also owned a piece of St. Cecilia's body. She owned a knuckle bone. Cecilia was very famous because her body was found to be uncorrupted. It was found in her tomb not to have rotted at all. And that was a discovery that was made in the 9th century. And I remember visiting the cemetery in the catacombs of St. Calixtus in Rome when I was in my teens and coming face to face with a model of the body, which completely freaked me out. But that's the point, really. It was so realistic. So one thing about St. Cecilia, apart from she's the patron saint of music, she was a virgin saint. Eleanor Duglioli did something which, even in the medical beliefs of her own time, was considered very strange. Her breasts produced milk, although she was a virgin, and they produced milk even after she died. Just a moment to just absorb that. So, like Mary, like Cecilia, Eleanor was a virgin. She'd wanted to become a nun, but she decided not to. And she was married off, I think probably this choice was mostly her family's. She was married off at the age of 15 to Benedetto dall'Olio. And she retained her virginity until her death. This was not unknown in Christian Europe. It was something that happened in royal or noble families, usually at the initiative of the wife. On the wedding night, Eleanor told her new husband a story about her favourite saint, Cecilia. Cecilia was married to the pagan Valerian, a forced marriage, and Cecilia told her husband there was an angel who would kill him if he tried to take her virginity. Valerian, not persuaded, asked to see the angel, and he was told, if you're baptized, you will see the angel. So he did, and he did see the angel. So no sex there. Now, Eleanor told that story to her husband on their wedding night. Very sexy moment, really. Benedetto was at first keen to try anyway, but as soon as he made any approach to her, the bridal chamber filled with interesting flickering lights. Very surreal. He decided not to risk it. We know that Eleanor's personal faith included the Song of Songs from the Bible and its bridal imagery for God, and perhaps her monogamous relationship with God was why she really couldn't possibly do anything with Benedetto. But the thing with Eleanor is her body went well beyond the virgin wife category. She menstruated, but only for 1 day at a time, lucky Eleanor. And in the world of blood which became milk, this was not the only outlet for her fluids. In 1510, she had a feeling that her breasts were swelling, and she started to produce what she thought might be milk. She remembered an earlier episode in her life where her breasts had produced something like that. She'd prayed to St. Agatha, who's often represented with her breasts on a plate like sort of 2 jellies, because she was martyred and had her breasts cut off. So again, Eleanor is seeing her body in religious terms. But then she heard Jesus telling her that before her death she would produce milk, and soon it was flowing as milk. She wasn't sure it was real milk, and she tried to dry it up using the sorts of remedies that people used when they had too much breast milk, but she kept hearing Jesus telling her, no, that's milk, and you'll produce it after you're dead. Now, I said that feeding from Mary's breasts was something imagined by some of the saints, but Eleanor was also seen in these terms. Eleanor's breast milk was seen as powerful. She fed her spiritual sons, including her confessor, Pietro Emerita, who used to hear her confessions, and Antonio Pucci of Florence, who was the papal nuncio. She gave them her milk in a glass, or sometimes in her cupped hand, but Pucci, papal nuncio, wanted it direct. So she said, okay, in October 1518. Somehow her breasts, lactating breasts of a virgin, had become completely devoid of any sexual connotations. In fact, it was even believed that if you drank her breast milk, it would calm down any sexual feelings you had. And this continued after her death. Because she lived in Bologna, after her death, her body was examined by the medical faculty there. Bologna, major university town, really big in the history of medicine and of dissection. Lots of people gave their opinions on her body, lay people, priests, surgeons, and the professor of medicine. And it was that guy, Pietro Emerita, who took the initiative in examining her body after death, one of her spiritual sons. He pressed her breasts as she lay dead, and milk came out. And at this point, those who drank from her breasts while she was alive also drank from them after her death. The surgeons who performed the post-mortem removed all her internal organs and preserved her body. They were also taken by her heart, which seemed to be like a piece of liver. They were very confused about her body all the way. But at the point where Eleanor's post-mortem took place, human dissection had only recently become part of the medical practice. It was still largely done to prove that the ancient Greeks and Romans were right, rather than challenge their claims about the body. So people looking at her body thought of it in terms of breast milk being converted from menstrual blood and so on. But even there, the idea of a virgin producing milk after her death was kind of out there. It was exceptional in any terms. For Eleanor, it was the fact, when she was alive, that she had breast milk and menstrual blood at the same time that was weird, because it should be one or the other in ancient medical terms. So medicine didn't really work. Religion, however, did. It was clearly an act of God. And somehow, even after death, her breasts were supposedly hot enough to produce produce milk from blood, to convert blood to milk. The medical experts could not come to any agreement, and she just remained as a mystery. And in the 19th century, she actually moved up the Catholic ranks to the Blessed Eleanor Dulioli, not yet a saint, but who knows? So there's breasts. How about the clitoris? Similarly, there's a is it for show or is it for use image. Is it for pleasure or is it for feeding babies with the breasts? Is it for pleasure or is it for conception with the clitoris? The idea of conception was that if you believed that the way human conception happened was that both men and women produced seed, and the two seeds mixed to make a baby, the woman must produce seed, otherwise you couldn't have a baby. If you believed that conception was due to women's blood as raw material, and then men's seed as the thing that makes that blood go into action, you didn't need the clitoris, you didn't need any sort of female pleasure, really. But if you believed that women produced seed like men did, you had to think of something like what happened in men, some sort of orgasm thing, to produce the seed. So it's partly what model of the conception that you go with, and both existed through most of Western history. But the story I want to tell for this is a much later story. It's from the 19th century. It's Isaac Baker Brown and the support of the church for his practice of clitoridectomy. Isaac Baker Brown was a London doctor and a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. He was very into surgery and developed techniques to treat ovarian cysts and tumours. But in 1858, he set up a clinic in Notting Hill, which was called the London Surgical Home for the Reception of Gentlewomen and Females of Respectability Suffering from Curable Surgical Diseases. Catchy title. Here he performed what he just called the operation, clitoridectomy. It would cure heavy periods, painful periods, hysteria, fits, hemorrhoids, piles, cancer, polyps, and religious mania. That's quite a mix. It was a time when gynecological surgery was being touted as the cure for far more than what we think of as gynecological problems, disorders of the mind as well as the body. One of the reasons why Brown would carry out the operation was, according to his own case records, distaste for marital intercourse. In the case of Mrs. X, age 32, after the operation, she became in every respect a good wife. He insisted post-operation patients were more cheerful. The expression on her face is much happier, he wrote. She is a very grateful patient. This is not that long ago. It's 30 years before my grandmother was born. His first operation in 1859 was on a Yorkshire dressmaker who'd been too ill to work for 5 years. Her symptoms were vomiting, pain, irregular periods, and constipation. Brown thought clitoridectomy was the answer, and so that's what he did. And he went on doing it. This was a very drastic treatment, even in an era of quite drastic remedies. He wouldn't operate on anyone under the age of 10, you'll be pleased to hear, but his patients were very young, including a 17-year-old girl with catalepsy, a nervous condition that causes bodies to become rigid and unresponsive to stimuli, who admitted that it was all her fault. She had, quote, long indulged in self-excitation of the clitoris, having been shown how to do this by a pupil at boarding schools. Boarding schools were always bad. Boarding schools, novels, featherbeds, bad. So he operated on her and, quote from the case notes, 5 weeks after the operation, she walked all over Westminster Abbey, whereas for quite a year and a half before treatment, she'd been incapable of the slightest exertion. It's interesting he mentions it was Westminster Abbey. Thank goodness it wasn't St. Paul's Cathedral. And this is fascinating to me because he used religion as a way of coping with some of the problems of doing an operation that was seen as quite dodgy. The dodginess was partly due to the issue of consent. When he was eventually expelled from the Obstetrical Society of London after a very violent row between the members about what he was doing. It was about consent, not the consent of the woman. Good grief, no, that was irrelevant. The consent of the husbands and the fathers. Husbands were reporting that they got their wife back from the clinic and she seemed to have got something rather different to what they were expecting. He didn't bother with their consent. And obviously, if he asked them, it would have been fine, but he didn't. Decency and respectability were big issues in an era where, as I say, gynecological surgery was being used for mental conditions as well as physical ones. It was an era when even mentioning sexual and reproductive organs was enough to damage your mental purity. And I think that's relevant to today, that whether we are confident to use the medical terms for our own bodies. In a lecture given in the 1890s, Thomas Spencer Wells noticed that you get the right sort of level of distaste on your face for this one. It was not uncommon to witness in women flippant familiarity with the jargon of gynecology. So even saying it was just not good. The other thing that Isaac Baker Brown did wrong in his own terms, the terms of his day, was he self-publicized. That was not something medicine thought was acceptable. He invited possible patrons of the home to come and see him operating. He published the name of visitors and donors to his home. The Princess of Wales visited. The Crown Princess of Prussia donated £10. He publicized this. He wanted the names of the great and the good associated with the home. And that included the church. In the report, the annual report of the home from 1865, the supporters listed including many bishops and both the archbishops of Canterbury and York. Canterbury was a vice president. York was one of the patrons of the surgical home. And in 1866, the Church Times advertised, "The clergy will be doing a service, especially to their poorer parishioners, by bringing this operation under the notice of medical men." The British Medical Journal later commented, "Fancy some innocent curate going about recommending this easy little operation for distressing cases of illnesses." So there's a lot going on there in which, because he's doing something that actually is quite dodgy, having the support of the church is somehow supposed to cover over the other dodgy aspects. That's dodgy in our sense, but also even in their sense, the self-publicity, the consent issue. Having the church involved makes it okay. He claimed a 70% success rate, but that was not enough to save him. Eventually, the things he did wrong, the consent thing, the self-publicizing thing, brought him down. It's a matter of professional values. So that's the clitoris. And now the hymen. The hymen, the idea of a physical marker that proves your purity and of loss of virginity as a one-way street, is very powerful in the history of Western medicine, although not actually an ancient Greek idea. And of course, even with the idea of the once and for all loss of the hymen, virginity restoration remedies were common in medicine. There's the idea of secondary virginity and so on. So my story here is a Mary story. Did Mary have a hymen? Well, the story of Mary's eternal unbroken hymen is one of those that you don't probably know about because you're not living in the 12th century. One of her titles, of course, is Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed garden, which is an echo of the Garden of Eden somehow, a place with sex without danger and fertility without strain. But the 2nd century Christian era proto-evangelium of James, probably from either Syria or Egypt, has the story in which there's a midwife present at Christ's birth and who declares the virgin birth as this new wonder. As the midwife leaves, she meets Salome, maybe another midwife, we can't tell, and tells her that a virgin has given birth. Salome goes, "Don't be daft. Course not, and I won't believe until I examine Mary for myself." So it's a very doubting Thomas moment. Unless I put my finger here, I will doubt it. So where does Salome put her finger? Well, obviously, she performs a vaginal examination. And in the original, it's "unless I put my finger in and examine her nature." The word nature there is translating the Greek physis, which is often used for the whole of a woman's genital arrangement, so vulva probably. It's not a term for the hymen. Salome's hand either catches fire or shrivels up, but depending on the version you read, when she touches Mary, but Jesus then heals Salome. In some versions, it's not the hymen, it's Salome's withered hand, which is the truth that Mary is a virgin. So what's Salome looking for if it's not a hymen? It could be the vagina, its tightness, still unstretched, no evidence of blood, no evidence of tearing. A historian of the early church, Julia Lillis, has recently argued the whole focus on Mary's body is not sexual virginity, but what she calls reproductive virginity. Interesting term, the idea that even after giving birth, you're still somehow a virgin. Unlike the Mary of the Bible, who responds to the angel Gabriel's announcement by asking how she can conceive when she does not know, clear sexual meaning, a man, in the proto-evangelium of James, she asks Gabriel, will I give birth as every woman does? The focus is on the birth, not on the conception. It's on the end, not the beginning. Now, that virgin status of Mary became even more convoluted and contradictory by the late 13th century when we have the poet Jacopone da Todi describing Christ's birth as the beautiful son is born without breaking the seal, leaving his castle with the gate locked. So very much Mary's virginity is dependent on this intact hymen that somehow stays there forever. This is actually used in later writing, as late as the 18th century, when there is a fascinating legal case in the UK, in England, where there is a marriage between George Downing and Mary Forrester in 1701. They're both very young. He's 15, she's 13, which makes them legally able to consent just in terms of the limits of the day. But the marriage wasn't consummated, and 14 years later, they had, I quote, contracted an incurable aversion to each the other. Couldn't stand each other, basically. The retired Bishop of Ely, Dr. Fleetwood, was brought in to discuss this legal case. Were they married or weren't they, if there was no consummation? He used the example of Mary to prove his case. He said, if you take the Bible, scripture, and the stories added to it by later Christians, tradition, quote, we are sure by scriptures they never came together till the Holy Child was born, and by tradition, sure they never came together after it was born. So no sex at all, yet their marriage was valid, suggesting sex wasn't necessary for something to be a marriage. And that's quite interesting now when the Church of England is wrestling with issues of same-sex marriage and whether you have to have a man and a woman for it to be a marriage. So there's no simple view of the hymen throughout the history of the Church. Sometimes people believe in it, sometimes they don't, in medicine and in religion. And St. Augustine has a great story of a midwife examining a woman to prove her virginity and in the process destroying her hymen. So that's fascinating. So actually not much good. And other Christian fathers talk about examinations to prove virginity, but usually say you can't prove anything like that. And finally then, the womb. Medically, it's miraculous. It's the most extraordinary organ in the body from the ancient world onwards, and it's also a sewer. It gets rid of bad stuff. Sewers are not necessarily bad. It's better than having a load of assorted filth, isn't it? Get it out. So sewers are probably good in an ancient context. The thing about the womb is it has no equivalent in the male body. Men have breast tissue. That's why men can get breast cancer. The hymen, well, there's still, if you go online, you will still find people asking on self-help sites, is there a male equivalent? Does the frenulum on the penis break in the way the hymen does? So they're trying to find an equivalent. As for the clitoris, there's a whole history of describing the clitoris as a sort of woman penis, a lady penis. So clitoris and penis are sort of equivalent. Wombs, there's just nothing in the male body to match. But the main thing I just want to mention here is the idea of the womb as a moving part. The wandering womb. I think the alliteration is part of the charm, and it's a really powerful image in the history of women's bodies in Western Europe. So just two spells for you. In ancient medicine, wombs could move up the body in search of moisture. They like to be wet. And they put pressure on other parts, particularly causing difficulty breathing. Here is a magical papyrus from the 3rd or 4th century of the Christian era, from Upper Egypt, from the time of the Roman occupation. It's a spell addressed to the womb, to be written on tin and tied to the body to stop the womb moving upwards. That's important because it makes it not just a spell, something you say, but an amulet, a physical thing that you use to change things in the body. So here's the spell. Anyone with womb problems, I'm doing this for you. I conjure you, O womb, by the one who set up his power over the abyss, before there was heaven or earth or sea or light or darkness, by him who created the angels, of whom first of all Ami Chamchu and Chuchao Keree Ueko Udu Prosegones, and by him who sits over the cherubim, raising up the throne that is his own, that you sit back down in your seat, womb, and neither lean towards the right part of the ribs nor the left part of the ribs, that you do not bite into the heart like a dog, but that you stand firm and remain in your place, gnawing on nothing, as long as I conjure you by the one who in the beginning made the heaven and the earth and all the things in it. Alleluia. Amen. That covers most things, doesn't it? The idea of the womb being like a dog may relate to the ancient idea of dogs as both highly sexual and also very fertile because they produce a litter. This is quite a spell. So that's from the Christian era. It's not explicitly Christian, but it's got cherubim and things in it, so it's going there. Not everyone agreed that the womb could move in the body. Some argued that it was absolutely impossible. The womb was just like everything else, back to similarity and difference. Some argued that the womb was made of the same stuff as every other part of the body and therefore behaved in the same way. It wasn't free to sort of move up and down. But even by the 10th century, when we're talking totally Christian here, when there was a certain amount of condemnation of amulets as something only foolish old women use, in a blank space in a medical text, so nice medicine-religion connection, a 10th century scribe wrote out a spell very similar to that one, but this time calling on the Trinity and naming the womb as follows. I conjure you, womb, by our Lord Jesus Christ, who walked on the water with dry feet, who cured the infirm, shunned the demons, resuscitated the dead, by whose blood we are redeemed, by whose wounds we are cured, by whose bruises we are healed. I conjure you not to harm this maidservant of God, nor to hold on to her head, neck, throat, chest, ears, teeth, eyes, nostrils, shoulders, arms, hand, heart, stomach, liver, spleen, kidneys, back, sides, joints, navel, viscera, bladder, thighs, shins, ankles, feet, or toes, but to quietly remain in the place which God delegated to you, so this handmaiden of God may be cured. The full extent of the power of the womb is seen here. All parts of the body can be affected by it. But also, there's that key message, remain in the place that God has delegated to you. My final point is just to go back to that flourishing word. I think all this matters because we need to know there's a history of our bodies and that it's not a positive history. We need to know what our body parts are called, although the old-fashioned names can be very charming. And back to that flourishing point, the imagery of flowers. There's a shadow side to this too. The positivity of saying that the female body is like flowers is actually great. It's not body shaming at all. It's quite positive. But there's a shadow side. Don't play with that bud or it won't open properly. If you don't marry when you are ripe for marriage, term used in ancient Greek medicine and beyond, ripe. If you don't marry when you're ripe, your body will rebel. Flowers are pure and they're fragile. They're easily crushed and damaged. Women need to be cultivated, treated properly, controlled, whatever that means, think of clitoridectomy, but not be wild. Wild is bad. But above all, women also need to remain in the place which God has delegated to you. Thank you. Oh, you do specialize in the tricky question there. Very good. Okay, so I started out when I did my PhD was on ancient Greek menstruation. Yeah, 80,000 words on that. It's amazing what you can do when you try. At that point, I was very much about similarity. And because I was reading texts which were focusing on this fundamental difference where it's not just your organs, it's every bit of your flesh, that seemed too much. And obviously, if you start saying women are that different, you then start saying that's why they can't do this, that's why they can't do that. As I've got older, I have become closer to the similarity in some ways, but I've also become closer to the difference in others, because it does seem to be the case that women's bodies do things like process drugs in a different way. So if you give a man and a woman the same dose of something for their weight, you may well have a different effect. So I'm now aware that you need to really do that difference thing properly too. So if you want to press me at this point, I'm going to say difference, but that doesn't mean difference in everything a woman can do and be. So it should not be a way of keeping women out of particular areas. I mentioned a story here. When I was much younger, I did some filming for some dodgy Channel 4 program on bodies. And when I say dodgy, it was kind of low budget. You know, they had an image of a female body from a historical manuscript on a gauze, and they kept it shimmering away by having a junior member of staff just fanning it desperately. So if you're aware of that going on, you know, and when I turned up, they said, for you, I think the tulips. And they had a sort of ancient Greek plinth with some wilted tulips on it, which was clearly the vibe I was giving. Very dodgy. And they had on it the gynecologist who was basically arguing that women should be excluded from pretty well everything from puberty onwards because their hormones were all over the place. And the only answer with women was to give them all drugs to stop the hormonal imbalances. So no one would be menstruating at all, and everyone would be completely under control. And that seemed to me a dodgy way to go. But he also claimed that he got this idea from the ancient Greeks, but when I pushed him on it, he couldn't say where. Thank you. It's a great question. One of the things I would say immediately there is that it's been used to argue that the hymen is really important. But of course, it doesn't have to be the hymen. One thing, even ancient Greek writers who are not really into hymens, one thing they said about first intercourse was that it may well cause damage to the internal parts. So simply the roughness of it, particularly when you've got a situation where the girl is likely to be a lot younger than the man and has no experience, whereas he does. So that just because we're talking about blood doesn't mean we have to have hymens. So that would be my first thing. The second thing would be to say that this idea of showing the blood is fascinating history. So it's often associated by the 16th and 17th centuries with foreign people, you know, sort of generally, whatever country you want to name, they do it, but we don't because we're civilized. So it becomes a sort of marker for barbarity versus civilization, which is interesting when, as you say, it's in Deuteronomy. And the third thing I'd say is that there is a very long history of people in cultures where this is expected who fake it. You know, let's just, you know, cut our fingers and put something on the sheet, because it still happens in, I think Armenia has the red apple ritual where you're given a bowl of red apples in the morning if you've produced the sheet with the blood on it. And women in Armenia have been very anti that and have been protesting about it for the last few years, and have also, you know, done sort of alternative rituals to try and make it seem rather less ghastly. But this idea of violence and bloodshed that has to be associated with first intercourse is very, very long-lasting and damaging. So even if you haven't got the theory of the hymen, there are certainly, in ancient Greek culture, there's the idea that some sort of blood will happen, but they're also aware that the girl is usually very young. The girl is also an interesting one between menstrual blood and blood of defloration. So there's a lot of doubt in early modern Europe about whether the blood on a sheet proves anything anyway, because it could have been that she's got her period. So there's a lot of discussion about how you shouldn't have first intercourse when it is your period because your body will be somehow relaxed. It'll make it too easy. And you think, hang on a minute, this is just completely, but the blood fixation, it's very big, very, very big. And it's Deuteronomy, it's probably to blame for that, yeah. Great question. I cover this quite a lot in the book because it's something I find fascinating. This is where I have a confession moment. My book is not a misery memoir. It's not about me, but there's some very good misery memoirs out there. Mine is not it. But when I was born, my mother wanted a girl very much. First child, only child, as it turned out. And the obstetrician who delivered me knew she wanted a girl, and he thought it was funny to say to her, "Oh, it's a lovely boy." And she went, "Oh no." And he went, "No, only joking." Whoa, so there we go. I was assigned male at birth for one moment there. It can be that easy. So the problem, of course, at birth is that you've got no idea other than the genitalia, the external genitalia. So there's lots of scope for error being made there. And certainly there's a long history of people talking in medical terms about someone who changes sex later on, or looking at the other way, whose true sex is revealed later on. In the ancient Roman world, there are stories of girls who, on their wedding night, or just bad moment for it really, suddenly a penis pops out, and oh gosh, let's rethink that marriage, shall we? Or jumping. The other classic one is jumping over a ditch. You know, you do something a bit energetic, and suddenly it comes out. Whether that's to say women shouldn't do energetic things, but should just stay at home and keep their legs crossed because you never know what might come out. I don't know. But yes, there are lots of stories of this kind, and the difficulty of deciding which sex you're going to go with, and whether it matters whether you go with one or the other. Yes, I think the problem there is that women don't have consent because they're not considered properly human. It's back to that issue of who can give consent, and who is the proper human. So if women are seen as equivalent to children, as not able to take part in the same things that men can take part in, then they can't really give consent. Therefore, if they say they didn't consent, does it really matter? And I think it's a very, very big question. And particularly, you then move to the issue with something like clitoridectomy. There are examples of women who have wanted. Princess Marie Bonaparte is one I never get to talk about her at talks because this is a woman in the early 20th century who decided she wanted her clitoris moved. And because she had the money, she could. So she had it moved more than once because she reckoned that sex just really wasn't doing the job. And if her clitoris was a bit nearer her vagina, it might. And so she went for it. So she's giving consent to something we would regard as dangerous surgery and a pretty bad idea. Then what happens if you're giving consent to any other type of operation on your body? So something like labiaplasty, so plastic surgery on your labia to make them smaller or different shape. You can give consent, you can pay money, you can have it done now. But then, should you be having it done? How much, you say my body, but how much is your body influenced by the society that's telling you what you should look like? And there's no answer to that. But it's worth asking the question. Also, you can do it in terms of a sort of racial thing or a civilization thing, like, oh, these people do this thing because they don't really understand, but we do understand. Not as simple as that either. One of my clitoris stories is that I got to talk to the House of Bishops on the subject of the clitoris some years ago. It was very interesting, particularly as there's a lot of them. This was the House and the College, so it's all of them, suffragans, area bishops. They had to have it in 3 sections because they couldn't get them all in one room, and it was part of a conference where there wasn't a big enough room, so I had to do it 3 times. The first time I thought, I must be mad. By the 3rd time, I was quite relaxed. But what was interesting was that when I was talking about clitoridectomy and female genital mutilation generally and cutting, they were all assuming I'm talking about other parts of the world other than England. So when I started telling them about Isaac Baker Brown doing it in London, you could feel the unease. This is not something which some people do, but we don't. It's something we, Western civilization, if you want to call it that, We have done that, and for worse reasons, probably. But then if someone wants to have that done, I just don't know what you do. You can tell them the risks, and certainly there's some communities in this country where traditionally cutting has been part of female maturation, who are very active in discussing it and sharing knowledge of what might happen and the dangers, and trying to talk people out of it, rather than just saying you mustn't do this because we don't like it, but just understand it more, think about the implications. So yeah, it's a good question. Again, all good questions. I'm very interested in this because I remember when women's ordination in the Church of England was being discussed, there was a debate broadcast from All Souls Langham Place about whether women could be priests or not. And I really wish this had been recorded somewhere I could find it. I've never found it since, but my memory is, while it's dodgy at times, is very strong on this. Somebody stood up and said, women can't be priests because they menstruate, so they are impure. And no one went, oh, don't be so ridiculous. It was completely, oh yeah, okay, that's a point. So the women's bodies have been brought into the debate on women's ordination in the last 40 years. And I don't think they've gone away. I think it's more that we just don't talk about that. I think the unease about women's bodies is still very much there. In the early days of women priests, I remember being told by somebody of an occasion when they were getting ready to take part in a service, and they would be the celebrant of the Eucharist, and the other priest involved, male, came up to them and said, "You're not going ahead with this, are you?" And she said, "Well, yeah, obviously." And he said, "But you've got tampons in your handbag." I'm like, what? What gives you the right? A, who cares? B, what gives you the right to check out whether a woman is menstruating or not? C, just because you've got tampons doesn't mean you're menstruating. There's so many assumptions there. So I think it is all still there. It's just not coming out in the way it did. So thank you. That's a killer question.